U.S. Marines told the old veteran it can't be done until he broke the range record first try. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The day was bright, and the atmosphere thick with the usual noise of military training. On the range, young Marines moved with practiced precision, their weapons gleaming under the hot sun. They were in the middle of a competition, their task simple but challenging. Hit a target nearly 1,000 yards away. Yet despite their high-tech gear and modern equipment, the target remained stubbornly elusive. A quiet, unassuming figure stood off to the side, watching. His name was George Miller, but no one knew him here. His hands were weathered with age, his back bent slightly from years of service, yet his eyes were sharp, scanning the range with the focus of a hawk. The Marines around him, fresh out of training, didn't pay him much attention. After all, he was just an old man, standing in the background. One Marine, a cocky young lieutenant named Ryan, sneered as he walked past George, muttering under his breath, "What's this old guy doing here? He's just taking up space." George didn't flinch. He simply watched as Ryan adjusted his rifle, lining up a shot. The target was far, the wind unpredictable, and the time ticking. Ryan pulled the trigger, but the bullet veered off course. The Marines snickered, muttering about how difficult the conditions were. Another shot, another miss. Ryan cursed under his breath, his frustration growing. "This is impossible," he muttered, turning to George with a smug grin. "Bet you can't do any better, old man." George's gaze shifted to the young officer. His voice was calm, steady, yet filled with quiet authority. "I've done it before," he said simply. Ryan chuckled. "Sure, Grandpa. Bet you haven't even held a rifle in decades." The other Marines laughed along, but George's expression didn't change. He stepped forward, his worn boots crunching lightly on the gravel. As he approached the rifle station, one of the younger Marines, trying to be helpful, handed him a rifle. "Here you go, sir. If you want to try," he said, voice dripping with mockery. George took the rifle in his hands. It wasn't a high-tech sniper rifle. It was a model from decades ago, old, simple, but still capable of performing in the right hands. He calmly set it down on the platform, his movements slow but deliberate, the focus in his eyes unwavering. The Marines gathered around, their laughter dying down, replaced by a quiet curiosity. With a deep breath, George adjusted the rifle's scope. He didn't rush. Instead, he observed the target, calculating the wind speed, the terrain, and the way the flags fluttered in the distance. The Marines waited, some still skeptical, others unsure of what to expect. Finally, George took his shot. A loud crack echoed across the range. Everyone's eyes followed the path of the bullet, and within seconds, the target dropped. The sound of silence followed. The Marines stood still, unable to process what they had just witnessed. George slowly lowered the rifle, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He turned to Ryan, who stood frozen, his mouth agape. "Impossible, right?" George said quietly. The young lieutenant didn't know how to respond. He could only stare in disbelief, his bravado from earlier shattered in an instant. The rest of the Marines remained motionless, their admiration and respect growing with every passing second. George wasn't just a retired veteran. He was a living legend, and they had just seen it with their own eyes. The Marines stood in stunned silence, their eyes locked on the target that had just fallen. It was impossible. They had all missed, their modern equipment failing them on a range that should have been routine. And then, George, an old man with a rifle older than most of them, had made the shot on his first try. The skepticism in their eyes turned into quiet admiration. Ryan, the cocky young lieutenant, still stood frozen, his jaw hanging open. George didn't wait for the applause or any acknowledgement. He simply lowered the rifle and handed it back to the young Marine who had given it to him. With a calm smile, he said, "Sometimes it's not the weapon, but the man behind it." The air around them shifted. The loud voices of the younger Marines faded into the background as they all processed what they had just witnessed. One by one, their attitudes changed. They started to see George for what he truly was, not just an old veteran, but someone who had lived and breathed the harsh realities of combat. The silence was broken by a voice from behind George. That was incredible. It was Sergeant Daniels, a seasoned Marine with over a decade of service. His voice carried a tone of respect, one that had not been present before. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, genuinely curious. George turned to face him, his smile softening slightly. "Back in the day, I didn't have the luxury of modern tech. It was just me, the rifle, and the enemy. You learn quickly when your life depends on it." Daniels nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "That was some shot, old man," he said, his respect evident in his voice. George didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the horizon, his mind drifting back to a different time. His mind wandered to the jungles of Vietnam, to the days when he had been a young soldier, barely out of his teens, holding the same rifle that now rested against his shoulder. "You know," George began, "there was a time when I couldn't afford to miss. The stakes were higher then. It wasn't just about the target. It was about survival." The Marines listened intently as George's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "I remember one mission in particular. It was deep in the jungle, and we were pinned down by enemy fire. The terrain was thick, and visibility was near zero. Our only hope was a shot from far away. I had to make it count. The difference between life and death depended on that shot. And it wasn't just my life. It was the lives of the men around me." He paused, his eyes growing distant as he recalled the memory. "I saw the target before anyone else did. It was a fleeting moment, but it was all I needed. One shot. That's all it takes." The silence hung heavy over the group. George's words echoed in their minds. They weren't just words of a man who had lived through the horrors of war. They were the words of someone who had lived, with the consequences of his actions, someone who understood the weight of a life taken. Sergeant Daniels broke the silence. "You saved them, didn't you?" he asked. George nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "I did, but not without cost. War takes a lot from a man. It takes pieces of you that you never get back. But you do what you have to keep the ones around you alive." The Marines around him were silent, each of them processing his words in their own way. For some, it was the first time they had truly thought about what it meant to be a soldier, to carry the weight of not only your own life, but the lives of those around you. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the moment. A black military jeep came into view, kicking up dust as it barreled down the road. The Marines snapped to attention as the vehicle came to a halt. From it stepped a high-ranking officer, Colonel Hayes, the commanding officer of the base. He surveyed the scene, his gaze settling on George. "Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice commanding. "I heard about the shot. Impressive." George stood tall, his posture straightening slightly. "Thank you, Colonel," he replied, his voice calm. "Just doing what I've always done." Colonel Hayes took a few steps closer, studying George carefully. "I've been told you have quite the reputation," he said. "More than just a veteran, I hear. You've saved lives. More than I care to count." George didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the young Marines standing in a line, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. "I'm just a man who did what he had to," George said quietly. "But I never forgot the men I lost. I never will." Colonel Hayes nodded solemnly. "I think it's time the others learn about the man standing before them," he said. "They've seen what you can do on the range, but they need to hear the stories. They need to know what it means to be a soldier." George turned to the Marines, his eyes meeting theirs. "I don't need accolades," he said softly. "I've lived through too many wars to care for medals. But if you're asking for the truth, it's this: war doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a survivor. And it takes everything you have to. Stay that way." The Marines stood in silence, their respect for the old man deepening with each passing word. The Marines stood in awe, the weight of George's words sinking in. Colonel Hayes had just finished speaking to the young officers, telling them that they needed to respect the man standing before them. George, the old soldier, had earned his place in history, but it wasn't about the records or the medals. It was about the sacrifice, the survival, and the silent battles fought every day. "Gather round," Colonel Hayes commanded. "Sergeant Miller, we need to hear more about what you've done." George looked at the group of Marines. They were young, eager, some with stars in their eyes, still full of dreams of heroism. But they didn't know the real cost of being a hero. "I didn't come here for any of this," George said, his voice low but steady. "But if you want to know what it's like to carry the weight of 1,000 lives, let me tell you something. The air was thick with anticipation. I remember the first time I fired a shot that mattered. George continued, his eyes darkening. It wasn't like the training you've all been through. No target practice, no guided sights. Just you, your weapon, and the men around you, depending on you to keep them alive. I was just a kid, but in that moment, I knew what it meant to be a soldier. Not a hero, just a soldier. The Marines listened intently, the noise of the range fading into the background as George spoke. In the jungles of Vietnam, there were no clean shots. No perfect conditions. We weren't fighting for medals or glory. We fought to stay alive and get our brothers home. You've got to know when to shoot, when to hide, and when to move. It's a game of life and death, and the only thing that matters is whether or not you come home. The Marines exchanged glances. It was a truth they hadn't been taught in basic training. It was one thing to know how to shoot, how to carry your gear, but it was something entirely different to understand the mental toll of war. I've seen more than my fair share of combat, George continued, his voice getting quieter, almost as if he was speaking to himself. And I've lost more good men than I care to remember. But every time, you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and keep moving forward. That's what being a soldier is about. It's not about how many kills you rack up or how many medals hang on your chest. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you don't want to. Sergeant Daniels stepped forward, his face serious. What's the hardest part of it, sir? He asked. George looked at him, his gaze unwavering. The hardest part is the silence that comes after. The quiet. It's the sound of the ones you couldn't save. The ones who didn't come home. There was a pause. No one spoke. The weight of George's words was heavy, sinking into the hearts of the young Marines. They didn't have the experience to understand fully, but they could feel the truth of it. George looked up at the sky for a moment, lost in thought, before shaking his head and bringing himself back to the present. I'm not here for your praise or your admiration. I'm here because there's a lesson you need to learn. I've seen the best of the best falter, and I've seen the worst of the worst rise to the occasion. It's not about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about knowing when to act and when to stay silent, when to fight and when to walk away. It's about survival. Colonel Hayes nodded, his face somber. I think the lesson has been learned, he said. It's time for all of us to remember why we serve. Not for the glory, not for the accolades, but for the men beside us. George gave a slight nod, his eyes scanning the young faces before him. Now, he said, breaking the tension, let's see if you can hit that target this time. The Marines didn't need to be told twice. They moved into position, their focus renewed. As they lined up their shots, George stood to the side, watching, not with the arrogance of a man who had proved himself, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had lived through hell and come out the other side. The wind picked up, the flags swaying, and the Marines took their shots. One by one, their bullets found their mark, hitting closer to the target than ever before. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And in the end, that's all that mattered. After the last shot rang out, George gave a simple nod of approval. Not bad, he said quietly. You've got potential. But remember, there's always more to learn. Stay humble, stay sharp, and never forget the lessons of those who came before you. The Marines stood in silence, their respect for the old veteran growing by the second. The moment was a turning point, a reminder that the true test of a soldier wasn't in how fast they could pull the trigger or how many targets they could hit. It was in their character, their ability to adapt, and their willingness to learn from the ones who had seen it all before. The Marines had wrapped up their session on the range, but the silence that followed felt different. They weren't just absorbing the lessons of the day. They were absorbing something deeper. Respect. It wasn't the kind of respect that came from rank or awards. It was earned through experience, grit, and the quiet confidence that only time and battle could provide. George had stayed behind, watching the young Marines, his posture as solid as ever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the range, and Colonel Hayes walked over to him. You've done more than just teach them how to shoot today, George, he said, his tone respectful. You've shown them what it means to truly be a soldier. George didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the horizon, his thoughts clearly somewhere else. You don't need to remind me, Colonel. These kids, they've got what it takes. They just need to know how to survive it all. Hayes paused, unsure of how to respond. The old man had a way of speaking that left no room for rebuttal, as if every word was a lesson. What do you mean? Hayes asked, genuinely curious. George sighed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It's not about hitting targets. That's easy. What's harder is living with the consequences when the shot matters, and knowing you may not make it home. Hayes looked at George, seeing the weight in his eyes, the years of service and loss, the quiet burden he carried. I've seen the best soldiers break, Colonel. George continued, his voice tinged with regret. You think you know what you're doing, that you've got it all figured out. But when it comes down to it, the battlefield doesn't care about your skills or your gear. It's about staying alive, about keeping your team alive. That's all that matters. The colonel stood there for a moment, reflecting on the harsh truth in George's words. Then he spoke again, his voice steady. Is that why you never talk about the past? Why you keep it all inside? George turned to him, his eyes meeting the colonel's, steady and unflinching. There's nothing to talk about, Colonel. What happened in the past is done. What matters now is helping these kids understand what it really means to wear that uniform. It's not about the glory or the recognition. It's about doing the job, even when the job is hard. The colonel nodded slowly, the weight of George's words settling in. He had served his time, seen the battles, but he still had much to learn. George had been through it all. The things he had seen, the lives he had touched, they were all etched into his soul, marking him in ways that no one could understand unless they had lived it. I think you've already taught them more than any drill could, Hayes said after a pause. But there's something you haven't told them. Something they need to know. George raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's that? Hayes looked out over the range, his gaze drifting toward the young Marines, who were now talking among themselves. You've been quiet about your time in the service. They know you're a veteran, but they don't know who you really are, what you've really done. George looked back at the group, his face unreadable. I don't need recognition, Colonel. The past doesn't matter. But Hayes wasn't backing down. It's not about recognition. It's about giving them the full picture. They need to understand who you are and why you're here. You've seen things they haven't. You've been through things they can't imagine. And that's what makes you the man they need to listen to. George was silent for a long time, but finally, he spoke, his voice low but clear. You want them to know the truth? The truth is, I didn't come here to teach them how to shoot. I came here because I owe it to them to make sure they don't make the same mistakes I did. The colonel stood there for a moment, processing. He hadn't expected that answer, but he understood it now. George wasn't here for recognition, wasn't here to relive the glory days. He was here to pass on what he had learned, the lessons that had cost him more than anyone could imagine. All right, George, Hayes said, his voice firm. Then it's time they heard the real story. As they made their way back to the Marines, the sound of footsteps echoed across the range. George had never been one to boast, to tell grand tales of battles won or enemies vanquished. But the Marines deserved to know what it really meant to carry the weight of a soldier's life. He wasn't going to hide from it anymore. The colonel had a point. These kids needed to hear the stories. They needed to know that the man standing in front of them had fought through hell and back, not just for himself, but for the men beside him. They needed to understand that sometimes the hardest battles weren't the ones fought on the front lines, but the ones fought in silence, long after the war was over. Gather around, George called to the young Marines, who looked up at him with curious eyes. I've got a story to tell you, and it's time you understood what it really means to be a soldier. The group fell silent, the air tense with anticipation. George took a deep breath and began. It was 1968. We were deep in the jungle, and the odds were stacked against us. But we had one thing the enemy didn't: each other. And that's what kept us alive. His voice carried over the range, steady and strong. We were outnumbered, surrounded. But we didn't give up. We fought until the last man was standing, because that's what soldiers do. We fight, not for the glory, but for the men beside us. The Marines listened intently, their expressions serious. George's story wasn't just about war. It was about the heart of a soldier. The heart that never quits, never backs down, and never leaves anyone behind. And for the first time, they truly understood what it meant to wear that uniform. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the military base. The day's training was over, but the lessons that had been imparted lingered in the air. The young Marines, still processing everything George had said, were no longer the same group that had walked onto the range that morning. They had heard the stories, felt the weight of the old veteran's words, and now, something had shifted inside them. George stood at the edge of the range, watching the horizon. His eyes, though tired, still held the same sharp focus they always had. Colonel Hayes walked up beside him, his footsteps soft on the gravel. "You've done more than teach them how to shoot, George. You've given them something no drill instructor ever could," Hayes said quietly. George didn't respond immediately, just nodded slowly, his eyes still on the fading light. "They needed to hear the truth," George finally said, his voice heavy with experience. "You can teach soldiers how to handle a rifle, how to follow orders. But you can't teach them what really matters until they understand what it means to survive. And that's something you only learn in the heat of battle." Hayes glanced at the group of Marines standing near the barracks, still talking in low voices. "They look up to you now," he said. "You've earned their respect." George shook his head slightly. "Respect comes with the job, Colonel. You don't ask for it, you earn it. But it doesn't mean much if you don't have the heart to back it up. These kids will get there. They'll find their own path. But it's not just about the shooting. It's about what happens when the bullets start flying, when the real fight begins." Hayes nodded, understanding the weight of George's words. The young Marines still had a long way to go, and they couldn't learn everything in one day. But for the first time, they were starting to understand the kind of soldiers they needed to become. The kind of soldiers who would fight for each other, no matter what. The next morning, the Marines were back at it, this time on a different kind of training exercise. The focus was no longer on shooting, but on teamwork, strategy, and trust. They were put through a series of mock combat scenarios, working together to overcome obstacles and solve problems as a unit. George watched from the sidelines, his eyes taking in the movements of each Marine. They were still rough around the edges, but they were improving. He could see the difference in how they communicated, how they moved, how they trusted each other. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the day wore on, the Marines were given a final challenge, a simulated hostage rescue mission. The scenario was intense, with the Marines having to work quickly and decisively to free the hostages while neutralizing the threats. The pressure was on, and it was clear that the stakes were higher than anything they had experienced so far. As they approached the building, George could see the tension in the young Marines' faces. This was different. This was real. The gunfire was loud, and the adrenaline surged through their bodies. But George watched them work together, each step taken with precision, each movement coordinated. They were finally beginning to think like a team. When the exercise was over, they stood in the aftermath, catching their breath. They had completed the mission, but there was something different in the air. They were no longer just Marines going through the motions. They had found something deeper. They had found their strength as a unit. George walked over to them, his steps slow but purposeful. "You did good," he said, his voice steady. "You're getting there. You've learned more in the past few days than some soldiers learn in a year. But this isn't the end. This is just the beginning." The Marines stood silent for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. They had proven something to themselves, but George knew the hardest part was still ahead. "You've got what it takes," George continued, his gaze sweeping over the group. "But it's not about the drills. It's about the man beside you. When you're in the field, and it all comes crashing down, that's when you'll know who you really are. It's not about what you can do alone. It's about what you can do with the man beside you. Never forget that." The Marines nodded, each of them understanding the depth of what George had said. They were no longer just soldiers. They were part of something bigger. They were a team. The days of individual glory were over. From now on, it was about each other. As George turned to leave, Colonel Hayes walked up beside him. "I think they're ready," Hayes said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. George looked at the young Marines one last time. "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Ready to survive," Hayes replied. George gave a small nod, his eyes distant. "Survival isn't something you're ready for," he said quietly. "It's something you become. And that takes time. But you're right. They're on their way." With that, George walked off, leaving the young Marines behind, knowing they had learned a valuable lesson. But the hardest lessons were the ones still to come. The weeks passed quickly, and the young Marines began to change. The lessons George had instilled in them were slowly taking root. They had learned to work as a unit, to think beyond themselves, and to trust in each other. But George knew that their true test had not yet come. What they had been taught on the range, in the drills, and through his stories was only the beginning. It was in the moments when they were alone, under pressure, and facing danger that they would find out who they really were. That day came sooner than expected. The Marines had been out on a routine mission, training in the wilderness. It was supposed to be just another drill, another day in the field, but something went wrong. The weather turned unexpectedly, and the group found themselves caught in a storm. The rain came down in torrents, drenching their gear, making the ground slippery and treacherous. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the noise of the wind and rain drowned out everything else. As the storm raged on, one of the young Marines, Private Anderson, slipped and twisted his ankle. The team immediately went into high alert. They had to get Anderson back to base, and fast, but the storm made it difficult to move quickly. George, who had been observing from a distance, could see the tension mounting. The young Marines were not used to this kind of situation, and fear was starting to creep in. "We need to move, now," Lieutenant Ryan barked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We can't leave anyone behind." The team rallied together, but the path back to base was uncertain, and the storm was getting worse. They had no choice but to push through. George stepped forward, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "Take it slow," he said. "We've got time. Rushing will get us killed." The Marines looked at him, some unsure, but they trusted him. They slowed their pace, carefully navigating the slick, muddy terrain. But Anderson's injury was slowing them down. After a few hours of slow progress, George turned to Ryan. "Lieutenant, you need to make a decision. We can't keep moving like this forever. Anderson's hurt, and we're running out of time." Ryan's face was tight with frustration, but he knew George was right. "We'll push through. We have no choice," Ryan said, though his voice wavered slightly. George nodded, knowing what was coming. "Okay," he said, "but don't let pride be the reason we lose someone." The Marines continued, but the storm had taken its toll. They were wet, cold, and exhausted, and Anderson's condition was worsening. George could see that they were reaching their breaking point. The fear was palpable, but he could also see the strength in them, the resolve to push on, even when the odds were against them. Finally, after hours of struggling through the storm, they reached a small outpost. It was abandoned, but it offered some shelter from the relentless rain. They brought Anderson inside and tried to treat his injury, but it was clear they were still far from safety. George looked around at the Marines. They were cold, tired, and scared, but there was something else, something more that had emerged in each of them. They were no longer just following orders. They were thinking, planning, and working as a team. And in that moment, George knew that they were ready. "We stay here until the storm passes," he said. "We've got food and water, and we'll rest. But I need you to understand something. This is what it's like. This is what you train for. Not the clean, easy stuff, but the real deal. It's when everything goes wrong, when it's all falling apart, that you need to keep your head and your heart in the game." The Marines nodded, some with a grim determination, others with a quiet fear that had been replaced with respect for the situation they were in. They had seen the worst of it, and they had made it through. The storm eventually passed, and the group made their way back to base. Anderson was hurt, but he would recover. They had faced the storm and had come out stronger because of it. When they returned, Colonel Hayes was waiting for them. He had been briefed on the situation and greeted them with a mixture of relief and pride. "You did well out there," Hayes said, his tone sincere. "You kept your cool under pressure, and you brought everyone back. That's what it means to be a soldier. You didn't quit, even when it would have been easier to give up." The Marines stood tall, their faces tired but proud. They had learned more in those grueling hours than they had in all the previous training. They had learned that survival wasn't about the equipment or the drills. It was about the strength of the team, the ability to trust each other, and the courage to face the unknown. George watched them, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You did good," he said quietly. "But remember, this is just the beginning. You've still got a long way to go." The Marines nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They had proven to themselves what they were capable of, and in doing so, had earned the respect of the man who had seen it all. George had shown them not just how to survive, but how to live, how to fight for each other, and how to keep going, no matter what. The days following the storm were quieter, but the tension in the air was palpable. The Marines had seen firsthand what it meant to face the unknown, to work under pressure, and to rely on each other when everything else seemed to be falling apart. George watched them closely, seeing how they interacted, how their confidence had grown. It was in the small things, the way they spoke to each other, the way they moved together as a team. They had been tested, and they had come through stronger. But George knew the real test was still ahead. The next mission would be the one that truly separated the soldiers from the survivors. The morning arrived with an unusual stillness. The base was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of activity seemed distant, replaced by the tense energy that always preceded something big. George could feel it in the air. He had been on enough missions to know when something was coming. And this time, it wasn't just a training exercise. It was the real deal. The briefing came in the early hours. The Marines gathered in the command center, their faces serious, their eyes sharp. Colonel Hayes stood at the front, his expression stern. "This is not a drill," he said, his voice steady. "We've just received intel. A situation has escalated on the outskirts of the base. It's a high-priority mission. We're moving out immediately." George listened, his mind already processing the information. The Marines had been trained for this moment, but now the time had come to see if they could put everything they had learned into action. "We'll be working in teams," Hayes continued. "George, I want you with them. Show them what you've got." George nodded without hesitation. He had already made up his mind. The young Marines were ready, but they still needed guidance, still needed that final push to help them realize their potential. "You've got this," Hayes added, his voice carrying a hint of pride. "Now, go out there and do what you've been trained to do." The team gathered their gear and moved out. The mission was simple in theory: reach the location, assess the situation, and neutralize the threat. But George knew that things were rarely as simple as they seemed on paper. The terrain was rough, the weather unpredictable, and they were heading into unknown enemy territory. As they made their way across the base, the Marines fell into formation, moving with the quiet confidence of soldiers who had been through the worst and come out the other side. George walked at the front, his eyes scanning the area, always alert, always ready. He could sense the change in them, the shift from uncertainty to determination. They were no longer the young, naive recruits they had been when they first arrived. They had become soldiers, each one of them knowing their role, trusting their teammates, and understanding the true meaning of the mission. The closer they got to the target area, the more intense the silence became. They moved through the dense forest, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. George led them through the thick brush, his movements calculated and precise. The Marines followed in his footsteps, their instincts kicking in. As they reached the edge of the clearing, George held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. The target was in sight. The enemy was positioned across the field, but they were unaware of the team's presence. George signaled for the Marines to get into position. They worked swiftly, each one finding their spot, their weapons ready. "Stay sharp," George whispered. "We move on my mark." The tension in the air was thick as they waited for the right moment. George could feel the adrenaline building, his senses heightened. This was what they had been trained for. This was the real test. A minute passed, then two. The Marines were steady, holding their positions, their focus unwavering. George glanced at Ryan, the lieutenant, who gave him a subtle nod. Ryan had come a long way from the cocky young officer who had first crossed paths with George. He had learned what it meant to lead, to make the hard decisions, and to trust in his team. "Now," George muttered. The Marines moved as one, swift and silent, advancing toward the enemy. The first shot rang out, breaking the stillness of the forest. It was a clean shot, precise and calculated. The Marines moved quickly, each one covering the other as they closed in on the enemy position. George led the way, his rifle steady in his hands, his focus absolute. The rest of the team followed, their movements flawless, the result of hours of training, trust, and teamwork. The enemy was neutralized quickly, and within minutes, the mission was complete. The Marines stood in the aftermath, their breathing heavy but steady. They had done it. The mission was a success. But George knew that the real victory wasn't in the mission itself. It was in the way they had worked together, the way they had trusted each other, and the way they had proven to themselves that they were more than just soldiers. They were a team, a family forged in the fire of battle. As they made their way back to the base, George couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The Marines had grown. They had faced the challenges, learned the lessons, and come out stronger on the other side. They were ready for whatever came next. And for the first time, George felt a sense of peace. The job was done, and the team was ready. It was all he had ever wanted to see. They had earned their place, and they had earned his respect. The days after the successful mission were filled with quiet reflection. The Marines had proven their worth, but George knew that the real test was not the missions, not the victories, or the accolades. It was how they handled themselves in the long run, after the dust had settled, after the adrenaline faded. He had seen too many soldiers come and go, too many who had thought they understood what it meant to be a soldier, only to fall short when the pressure mounted. But these young Marines were different. They had started to understand the true cost of survival, the price that came with being a soldier. It wasn't about the gear, the medals, or the records. It was about something deeper, something that only experience could teach. One morning, George sat alone in the mess hall, nursing a cup of coffee. The rest of the team was off on another exercise, but George had opted to stay behind. He wasn't a fan of the endless drills. Instead, he liked the quiet moments, the chance to reflect. He had seen a lot in his time, and sometimes, the only thing left to do was sit and think. As he stared into his cup, Colonel Hayes walked in and slid into the chair across from him. "Mind if I join you?" Hayes asked. George looked up, a faint smile on his lips. "Not at all, Colonel. What brings you here?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "I've been watching the team, George, and I've been thinking. They've come a long way, but there's something missing." George raised an eyebrow. "Missing? What do you mean?" Hayes hesitated for a moment before speaking. "They've got the skills. They've got the discipline, but they're still holding back. They're still not fully committed. They're not trusting each other the way they should." George nodded slowly. He had noticed it too. The Marines had learned how to operate as a team, but there was still a wall between them. They were doing the job, but they weren't living it. They weren't fully invested in one another. "It's not something you can teach in a few drills," George said quietly. "It's something that takes time, something they have to learn through experience. They've got to understand that they're all they've got out there. There's no backup, no safety net. Just them." Hayes was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I think you're right. But how do we get them there? How do we break down that wall?" George sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought. "They've got to be put in a situation where they have no choice but to trust each other. Something that challenges them, something that forces them to depend on the team. They've been working together, but they haven't truly been tested as a unit." Hayes looked at him with interest. "You have an idea?" George smiled faintly. "I think I do." The next day, the Marines were given their new mission. It wasn't a typical training exercise. It wasn't a straightforward task where they could rely on their individual skills. It was something different, something designed to test their trust in one another, to force them to work as a team. They were to retrieve a package from a remote location deep in the woods. The terrain was rough, and the weather was unpredictable. There would be no backup, no air support, and no easy way out. It was a scenario designed to push them to their limits. As they set out on the mission, George could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were ready for another drill, another mission to prove their skills, but this was different. They were about to be tested in ways they hadn't been before. They hiked for hours, the heavy packs on their backs weighing them down. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the sound of their boots crunching on the dirt was the only noise that broke the silence. As they neared the location, the weather began to turn. The sky darkened, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The team moved quickly, but George could see the unease in their movements. They were all still trying to act as individuals, still unsure of each other. That's when it happened. The storm hit without warning. The winds were ferocious, the rain came down in sheets, and the visibility dropped to almost nothing. The team struggled to stay on course, their equipment getting soaked, their communication lost in the wind. George could see the panic starting to set in. They were not prepared for this, and it was clear that the mission was in danger of falling apart. "Stay calm," George shouted over the storm. "We stick together, no one gets left behind." But even with his commanding voice, George could feel the uncertainty in the air. The team wasn't trusting each other the way they needed to. That's when George made a decision. He split the team into pairs, forcing each Marine to rely on someone else for the first time. "You two, go ahead and secure the path," he ordered. "You two, follow me, stay close. And stay focused. This is where you find out if you really trust your brothers or not." The pairs moved out into the storm, and George watched as they struggled at first, unsure of how to work together. But as they pushed forward, something started to change. The team began to lean on one another, offering assistance when needed, sharing resources, and looking out for each other. It was slow at first, but then they started to move like a single unit, not just a group of individuals. The mission was still a struggle, but the way they handled it was different. They were working as a team, truly trusting one another for the first time. After hours of difficult progress, they reached the location. The package was secured, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how they had come together to make it happen. As they made their way back to base, George could see the difference in them. The tension had melted away. They were no longer just soldiers doing their jobs. They were a team, bound together by trust and shared experience. George smiled to himself. It wasn't just about the mission. It was about what they had learned in the process. The Marines had passed the test. They had become more than just a unit. They had become a brotherhood. The Marines had proven themselves, but George knew that their journey wasn't over. The experience of surviving the storm, working together under pressure, and successfully completing the mission was just the beginning. There were still lessons to be learned, and the hardest challenges were still ahead of them. The days following the storm were filled with a sense of quiet confidence. The Marines, once hesitant and unsure, now moved with purpose, their actions more deliberate. George watched them closely, his eyes observing every detail. He could see the difference in how they interacted. There was a newfound respect among them, an understanding that they were not just individuals, but a unit. Their communication had improved, their movements were more coordinated, and their trust in each other was solidifying. But George knew that the next test would be even more difficult. The real test of their unity would come when they were forced to face a true enemy. The opportunity came sooner than George expected. The Marines were sent on a training exercise, one that would push them beyond anything they had encountered so far. It wasn't a simple drill or a mock mission. It was a real, high-stakes operation. They were to infiltrate a mock enemy camp and extract valuable intelligence. The mission was complex and dangerous, with multiple obstacles along the way. The team had to work together to navigate the terrain, avoid detection, and gather the intel without getting caught. As they prepared for the mission, George could feel the tension in the air. The Marines were ready, but there was still an undercurrent of uncertainty. They had never faced an enemy like this before. George knew that their true test was coming. As they approached the enemy camp, the team was in high spirits, but that confidence quickly turned into caution. The area was quiet, too quiet. The tension was thick, and every rustle of the leaves seemed louder than it should have been. The Marines moved through the dense forest, their rifles ready, their eyes scanning the surroundings. They had to stay alert, ready for anything. As they neared the camp, George signaled for the team to halt. He crouched down, his eyes searching the area. The camp was heavily guarded, with armed sentries posted at strategic points. It was clear that this would be no easy task. "We need to move in closer," George whispered. "Stay low, stay quiet. We do this together, or not at all." The Marines nodded, their faces set with determination. They moved as one, creeping closer to the camp, each step calculated, each movement deliberate. George could feel the weight of the mission on his shoulders. This wasn't just about completing the objective, it was about proving that they could handle whatever came their way. They reached the outskirts of the camp without being detected. The sentries were positioned in a way that would make it difficult to get close without being seen. George quickly formulated a plan. "We'll split into 2 teams," he said. "Team 1 will create a distraction. Team 2 will move in to extract the intel." Ryan, now fully in command, took charge of Team 1, while George led Team 2. The plan was simple, but risky. George trusted Ryan to create the diversion. He knew Ryan had grown into his role as a leader. The time came, and the distraction was set into motion. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, signaling the start of the plan. The sentries, distracted by the noise, moved toward the source of the disturbance. This gave George and his team the opening they needed. They moved quickly, slipping into the camp and making their way toward the intel. The operation was going smoothly, but George could feel the tension building. They had to move fast. As they reached the area where the intel was stored, disaster struck. One of the Marines, Corporal Davis, tripped on a loose rock and fell, the noise echoing through the camp. George's heart raced. He motioned for the team to stay down. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." But the sentries were already on alert. They had heard the noise and were closing in. The team had no choice but to fight their way out. Go! George shouted. The Marines sprang into action, opening fire on the advancing sentries. It was chaotic, the sound of gunfire and shouting filling the air. George moved swiftly, covering his team as they made their way back toward the extraction point. Ryan's distraction had worked, but now the team had to rely on their training to make it out alive. The Marines fought their way through the camp, their movements synchronized, each covering the other. George's mind raced as he calculated their path to safety. They were almost there, but they needed to move fast. Keep moving, George shouted. We're almost there. Just as they reached the extraction point, a burst of gunfire rang out, narrowly missing George. He turned, seeing a sentry in the distance, firing in their direction. Without thinking, George returned fire, taking out the threat. The team was safe, just barely. As they loaded into the extraction vehicle, George looked at the Marines. They were all breathing heavily, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had completed the mission, but they had also learned something more. They had faced an enemy together, and they had come out the other side stronger. George nodded in approval. You did good, he said quietly. But remember, it's not about the mission. It's about the team. You trust each other, and you keep moving forward. That's how you win. The Marines nodded, understanding the lesson. They had proven themselves, not just as soldiers, but as a team. And that was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The days following the mission were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. But George knew that the Marines still had a long road ahead of them. They had proven themselves capable, but that was just the beginning. The real challenges were still to come, and George understood that well. As he watched the Marines settle back into their routines, he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in their demeanor. They had become more confident, more decisive, but there was still something missing. The trust they had developed as a team was solid, but now they needed to take it a step further. It was time for the next test. One afternoon, as the team gathered for a routine briefing, Colonel Hayes entered the room with a serious look on his face. The usual chatter ceased immediately as all eyes turned to him. Listen up, Hayes began. We've just received word about an impending situation. It's not a drill this time, folks. This is real. The room fell silent as Hayes continued. We've got intel on a possible hostile group operating in a nearby region. The location is unstable, and we need to act quickly. The mission will be dangerous, and it's crucial we move in as one team. George, I need you to lead them through this one. George nodded without hesitation. The Marines around him looked determined, but he could see the flicker of apprehension in their eyes. They were no longer the unsure recruits they had once been, but the reality of combat still weighed on them. This mission would test them in ways they had yet to experience. They weren't just going out to retrieve intel or neutralize a threat. They would be operating in a real combat environment, facing an enemy that wouldn't hesitate to fight back. As they suited up and gathered their gear, George could feel the tension building. The Marines were ready, but the stakes were higher now. They had trained for this, but there was no way to fully prepare for the uncertainty of war. The journey to the mission site was long, with the team traveling by vehicle through rugged terrain. As they approached the outskirts of the area, the vehicle slowed to a crawl. George could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He turned to face the team, his gaze steady but serious. Listen, he said, his voice low. We've been through a lot together, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. But this mission is different. The enemy we're facing won't be like the ones we've trained for. They'll be unpredictable. So keep your heads on straight. Trust each other, and remember what we've trained for. We move as one, or we don't move at all. The Marines nodded, their faces set in determination. They had grown accustomed to George's calm demeanor and knew that when he spoke, it wasn't just a lesson, it was a command. They moved out as a unit, their movements synchronized, each one covering the other. The jungle around them was thick, the air humid and heavy. The terrain was treacherous, with thick brush and uneven ground making every step more difficult. They moved cautiously, staying low and sticking to the shadows. The tension in the air was palpable. They had to stay alert, ready for anything. As they reached the enemy's location, George signaled for the team to stop. The enemy camp was ahead, a series of makeshift tents surrounded by armed guards. They could see movement inside, but the situation was unclear. George's mind raced as he analyzed the best course of action. We'll move in from the left, he whispered to Lieutenant Ryan. You take the right flank with your team. I'll take the center. Stay low, stay quiet. We do this fast and clean. Ryan nodded, giving him a brief salute before moving out with his team. George's team moved with precision, creeping through the dense underbrush, careful not to make a sound. Every step was calculated. Every movement was deliberate. The Marines were no longer just following orders. They were operating as a single unit, moving as one. They reached the camp's perimeter without being detected. George signaled for them to halt and took a moment to assess the situation. The guards were vigilant, but there were enough blind spots to exploit. On my mark, George said, his voice barely above a whisper. We take them out quietly. No noise, no unnecessary risks. The Marines nodded in unison, their focus razor-sharp. The time came, and George gave the signal. They moved quickly, silently, taking down the guards one by one. The operation was smooth, each Marine executing their part flawlessly. It wasn't the chaos of a firefight. It was a well-coordinated dance, one that relied on trust and precision. As they entered the camp, George's heart raced. This was the moment. They had to secure the intel and get out without alerting the rest of the enemy force. He motioned for the Marines to spread out and search for the package. The tension was high, but the team's trust in each other was evident. They had become more than just soldiers. They were a cohesive unit, working together seamlessly. George's eyes scanned the camp, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the center. The package was there, secured in a locked tent. He reached for the lock, his fingers steady despite the urgency of the moment. With a quick motion, he unlocked the door and entered. The intel was exactly where it was supposed to be. We've got it, he called to the team. But just as he turned to leave, a sound echoed from outside. The enemy had found them. The battle was about to begin. Fall back, George shouted, his voice commanding. Stay together, stay sharp. We fight as a team. The Marines snapped into action, moving quickly but methodically, covering each other as they made their way toward the extraction point. The gunfire started as a distant sound, but quickly grew louder as the enemy closed in. The Marines fought their way through the camp, taking down any threats that got in their way. George's mind was focused, but his heart raced. This was the moment that would define them. They fought hard, but the trust they had built over the past weeks carried them through. The team reached the extraction point, the mission completed, but they knew this was just another step in their journey. They had passed the test, and they had done it together. As they loaded into the extraction vehicle, George looked at his team, his heart swelling with pride. They had proven that they were more than just soldiers. They were a brotherhood. The Marines had returned to base after the mission, the adrenaline of the firefight still coursing through their veins. But there was no time for celebration. They had completed their task, but the reality of their journey was just beginning to sink in. They had faced an enemy, neutralized the threat, and extracted the intel they needed. But now, they had to process what that mission had meant. George stood off to the side, watching as the team regrouped. The sounds of boots on gravel filled the air as the Marines walked back to their quarters. Their movements were slower now, a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. But George could see that something had changed in them. The mission had tested them, yes, but it had also solidified their bond. They had fought together, trusted each other, and come out the other side stronger. It was more than just completing a task. It was about proving to themselves what they were capable of. As they gathered for the debriefing, Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the team. The room was silent as the Marines took their seats, waiting for the next words to come. You did well out there, Hayes began, his voice steady. You worked together. You followed your training, and you completed the mission. But I need to remind you of something. This is just the beginning. What you faced out there is nothing compared to what's coming. George watched them closely, seeing the flicker of concern in their eyes. They had done well, but Hayes was right. This was only one mission in a much larger war. The Marines had learned how to handle themselves in the field, but now they had to understand the true nature of what it meant to be soldiers. You've learned how to fight, Hayes continued. But now, you need to learn how to survive. This isn't about killing the enemy. It's about staying alive. It's about making sure your brothers and sisters make it home. The room was silent, each Marine reflecting on the weight of those words. George could see the realization dawning on them. They had been so focused on the immediate goal, the thrill of the mission, that they hadn't fully grasped the long-term reality of war. The colonel paused, letting the tension build before speaking again. You'll be tested again, and again, and again. And each time, you'll face new challenges. But the question isn't whether you can handle the physical challenges. The question is whether you can handle the mental ones. Hayes turned to George, his expression firm. George, I want you to take them out again. This time, make it harder. Push them further. I want them to understand what it really means to survive, not just to fight. George nodded, understanding the colonel's intent. The Marines had been tested in a controlled environment. Now it was time to put them in a situation where they had to rely on their instincts, their training, and each other. The next day, they were back in the field. This time, the mission was different. It wasn't about neutralizing an enemy or gathering intel. This time, it was about surviving in an unfamiliar environment, under constant pressure, with no backup. The team was dropped off miles away from base, with minimal supplies. They were tasked with navigating through rugged terrain, avoiding enemy patrols, and reaching a designated extraction point. There would be no safety net, no support. They had to rely on their skills and each other. As the Marines hiked through the dense forest, George led the way, his mind constantly analyzing the terrain, the weather, and the possible threats that could arise. The team was silent, focused on the task at hand. They were moving more efficiently now, their steps coordinated, their senses alert. George could feel the difference in how they operated. They were no longer hesitant. They were working as a cohesive unit, relying on each other's strengths. But as the day wore on, the physical strain began to take its toll. The terrain was difficult, the weather unpredictable, and their supplies were running low. They hadn't encountered any enemy forces yet, but the tension was building. They knew it was only a matter of time. As night fell, they set up camp in a secluded spot, careful to keep their fires low and their movements quiet. George sat at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the darkened forest. He had been in situations like this before. The waiting was always the hardest part. The Marines were tired, their bodies sore from the long hours of hiking. But they had learned the importance of maintaining discipline. They knew that rest was crucial, that staying alert was the key to survival. George watched them, his pride swelling as he saw how far they had come. They were no longer the same group of soldiers who had first walked onto the training field. They had grown, not just in skill, but in character. But George knew that the true test was still ahead. It wasn't enough to be strong, to be quick. They had to learn how to stay calm, how to think clearly when everything was falling apart. As the night passed, the team took turns keeping watch, each member doing their part to ensure that everyone remained safe. The air was thick with tension, but there was a sense of unity among them. They were a team, and no matter what came their way, they would face it together. The next morning, they continued their journey toward the extraction point. The terrain was even more challenging, but the Marines were ready. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the horizon, their minds focused. And as they neared their destination, George could see the difference in them. They were no longer just soldiers following orders. They had become a family, bound by the experiences they had shared, the hardships they had endured. They had learned the true meaning of survival. When they reached the extraction point, they were tired, dirty, and hungry. But they had made it. They had survived. As the helicopter landed to pick them up, George looked at his team, his pride in them clear. They had faced the toughest challenge yet, and had come out the other side stronger. They had passed the test. But George knew that there were more tests to come, and he knew they were ready. The Marines were back at the base, their bodies sore from the grueling exercise, but there was no time to rest. The mission had been a success, but George knew that the real challenge lay in how the team would recover and adapt from it. They had come far, but there was always more to learn. The debriefing room was quiet as the Marines filed in, each one looking tired but also a little more confident. Colonel Hayes was at the front of the room, his face calm but serious. "You did well," he began, his voice steady. "You've learned how to rely on each other. You've learned the importance of teamwork. But there's still one thing I need to make sure you understand. Everything you've learned so far is nothing compared to what's coming." George stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed, observing the group. The Marines had been through a lot, but Hayes was right. The world outside the base didn't care about their training. It would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. "This is not the end," Hayes continued. "You've learned the basics, but now you need to be prepared for the chaos that's coming. It's going to get worse before it gets better. but I'm confident in each of you. You've proven that you can handle anything that's thrown your way." The Marines sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of what Hayes was saying. It wasn't just about surviving the next mission. It was about staying alive when everything was against them, about knowing when to fight and when to step back. George knew this wasn't going to be easy. The next phase of their training was about to begin. They needed to be pushed further, tested more, and made to face their fears. As they left the debriefing room, George caught up with Ryan, who had been leading the team with increasing confidence. "You've come a long way," George said, his voice low. "But it's not over. You know that, right?" Ryan nodded, his face serious. "I know. We've got a lot more to prove." George gave him a small smile. "You've already proven a lot. But the real test is yet to come." The next few days were intense. The Marines were put through a series of exercises designed to challenge them physically and mentally. They were forced to face their own weaknesses, pushed to the brink of exhaustion, and tested in ways they hadn't expected. But with each passing day, they grew stronger, more cohesive, more focused. It wasn't about the drills anymore. It was about survival. George watched them closely, his eyes sharp. He could see the transformation in them. They were no longer just following orders. They were thinking for themselves, making decisions, trusting their instincts. They had learned to trust each other, and now they were beginning to trust themselves. One morning, they were taken out into the field for a final exercise. This time, there would be no backup, no instructors to guide them. It would be just them and the environment. The exercise was simple in theory: navigate through hostile terrain, avoid enemy patrols, and extract without being detected. But the real challenge was in the details. The terrain was unforgiving: thick forest, steep hills, and unpredictable weather. The Marines had to rely on their training, their equipment, and each other. As they set out, George gave them one final piece of advice. "You've got everything you need to succeed, but you need to stay sharp. Trust each other, and keep moving forward." They moved out in silence, their steps coordinated, their movements fluid. For the first time, they didn't have to be told what to do. They knew their roles, and they played them well. The team worked like a well-oiled machine, each member knowing exactly where they needed to be and what they needed to do. The hours dragged on, but they didn't stop. They pushed through the fatigue, through the cold and rain, until they reached the extraction point. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. They made mistakes, they stumbled, but they never stopped moving forward. As they gathered at the extraction point, George looked at them, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. They had done it, not just because they were skilled or strong, but because they had trusted each other. They had learned what it really meant to be a team. As the helicopter touched down to pick them up, George turned to Ryan, who was standing beside him. "You did good," George said quietly. Ryan looked at him, his face tired but content. "We did good. All of us." George nodded. "Yeah, you did. You've come a long way, and you're ready for whatever comes next." The Marines climbed into the helicopter, their bodies weary but their spirits high. They had passed the test, but they knew the real challenges were still ahead. As the helicopter lifted off and the base began to disappear beneath them, George felt a sense of peace. The Marines had learned something important. They had learned how to survive, and that was what would carry them through the toughest times to come. The Marines had been through their share of grueling tests, but now, as they stood at the edge of the airfield, the weight of their journey seemed to sink in. The helicopter that had taken them out on their last mission now sat silently on the tarmac, its engines humming softly, ready to carry them back to base. George stood to the side, his eyes scanning the team. They had come so far in such a short time. These young men and women who had once been unsure, hesitant, and untested were now soldiers who could hold their own in the toughest of situations. They had survived the storm, navigated treacherous terrain, fought side by side, and learned to trust each other. They were no longer just a group of individuals following orders. They were a brotherhood. But as much as George wanted to feel content with their progress, he knew there was more to be done. The world outside wasn't getting any easier, and the challenges ahead would test them in ways they couldn't even imagine. The helicopter engines roared to life, and the team boarded, taking their seats with a sense of quiet resolve. As the chopper lifted off the ground, the base grew smaller below them, and George found himself looking back at the journey they had been on, at the young faces that had changed in ways no one could have predicted. For the first time, He allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. But there was no time for rest. As the helicopter soared higher, the team settled into their seats, each one reflecting on the lessons they had learned. They had learned how to fight, how to survive, but more importantly, they had learned how to stay human amidst the chaos. George looked out the window, his gaze distant. The world below was changing, and so were they. The Marines had become something more than just soldiers. They had become a unit, a family, and in the world they were about to face, that would be the most important thing they could rely on. As they neared the base, George could see the familiar silhouette of the command center. It felt different now, though. The base, once just a place of training, had become a home for the team. They had earned their place here, and they had earned each other's trust. They had faced the worst and come through it stronger. The helicopter touched down, and the team disembarked, the familiar sounds of the base greeting them as they walked toward the hangar. George's footsteps were steady, his mind focused on the future. They were ready. They were more than ready. They were capable. The team had passed the hardest tests they would face. Now, they would be sent out into the field, ready to face the real world. "You've done well," Colonel Hayes said as he walked up to George. "I've seen the growth in all of them. You've given them the tools they need, but more importantly, you've given them the heart they've been missing." George nodded, his eyes meeting the colonel's. "They did it themselves. All I did was show them the way." Hayes smiled slightly. "That's what I've always admired about you, George. You don't take credit where it's not due. But I know better. You've shaped them into soldiers, and more than that, you've shaped them into leaders." George shrugged, a small smile on his lips. "They've got the strength. They just need to keep trusting each other. They'll be fine." The Marines stood behind them, their expressions serious but filled with quiet pride. They had seen the hardest parts of their journey, but now they were looking ahead to the future. They were no longer just soldiers, they were leaders in their own right. The next chapter of their journey was just beginning. "You've earned a break, George," Hayes said, his voice softening. "You've done more than anyone could ask." George didn't respond immediately. His gaze turned to the team, to the young faces that had once been uncertain and now stood strong and confident. They had earned this moment. But George knew, deep down, that their journey was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more challenges to face. But for now, they could take a moment to breathe, to rest, and to remember the journey they had been through together. "They're ready," George finally said, his voice steady. "They've earned it." The colonel nodded, and the two of them stood together in silence, watching the team. George had seen soldiers come and go in his years of service, but there was something different about this group. They were stronger than they had been, not just in body but in mind and spirit. They were a team, a family, and that was something no one could take from them. As the team headed toward the barracks, ready for a brief rest before their next mission, George followed behind. He knew that they were ready for anything that came their way. They had the heart, the skill, and the trust in one another. And as long as they held on to that, they would make it through whatever the world threw at them. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, George felt a sense of peace. He had done what he came to do. The team had learned what it meant to survive. And that was the greatest lesson of all. This emotional story takes you through the journey of a group of Marines who face extreme challenges, both on the battlefield and within themselves. As they go from being uncertain soldiers to a well-oiled, cohesive team, they learn the true meaning of survival, trust, and brotherhood. Through George, a seasoned veteran, they come to understand that it's not just about the mission or the glory. It's about staying alive and protecting one another no matter the cost. This emotional story highlights the growth of the Marines as they overcome obstacles and face real-life tests that push them beyond their limits. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest strength lies in working together, relying on each other, and embracing the difficult truths that come with being a soldier. As the Marines go through each test, they realize that survival isn't about individual prowess, but about the unity of the team, as they learn to trust each other under the most intense pressure. This emotional story shows that when the stakes are high and the pressure is on, it's not about how strong you are, but about how much you trust those around you. The emotional story that unfolds emphasizes the importance of resilience and the unspoken bond that grows between soldiers who fight side by side. With each trial, the Marines evolve, becoming not just a group of soldiers, but a true brotherhood. The story is a moving testament to the strength of human connection in the face of adversity, with each Marine finding their place in a family forged by fire. This emotional story will leave you inspired by the unwavering determination of those who choose to serve, to sacrifice, and to fight for something greater than themselves.